Hello, welcome everyone to the National Archives Foundation's virtual program series. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation, and we're really glad you've joined us this afternoon for a wonderful program. Through this program, the National Archives, we're able to share the treasures. The doors are closed, but the treasures are with you, the American people. And this afternoon, we're going to hear a lot about a Texan who made quite a bit of a difference in our country's history. By now, you've been receiving our American Experience emails on Tuesdays, or our History Snacks emails, which are crafted with content for our young historians on Fridays, and enjoying that content. We're delighted to launch the Presidential Library series today. Some of you who have visited presidential libraries know about the Archives Presidential Presidential Library Passport, where you get stamps as you go around the country to the different presidential libraries. Well, we're going to bring that to you virtually here while our museums are closed. We thought it'd be fun to share what these museum experiences are like around the country, and what some of the insights are about these presidents and their legacies. Today, we'll start out with the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library Director, Mark Lawrence. Before we do that, though, we want to make sure you know how to ask questions along the way. So next to the video, you'll see a chat box where you can enter your questions. So he's going to give a presentation. Feel free to ask your questions as we go along, or when we get to the end, we'll do a Q&A session. And we'll get those questions organized, so when we get to that point, we're able to ask your questions. Just so we know you know how to use that, go ahead and tell us where you're watching from today. I know we had several hundred people RSVP. We love to hear what part of the country you're tuning in from. So send us your city and state, and a little bit later, I'll see if we can give many of you a shout out along the way. Look forward to seeing that. Now our speaker, Dr. Mark Lawrence, is considered a prominent scholar of President Johnson and the Vietnam War. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Texas in Austin. In 2015, he's taught the University of Texas undergraduate course LBJ Presidential Library entitled The Johnson Years. He's authored 2 award-winning books and edited and co-edited a number of aspects on U.S. foreign relations and the Vietnam War. He's had op-eds or reviews in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe. He was also a consulting historian for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. He's originally from Fall River, Massachusetts, so I'm guessing it's a little warm down in Austin today relative to that. He's got a bachelor's degree from Stanford and a doctorate from Yale. Mark, welcome to our live stream virtual program. And how are you doing? First of all, how are you and your family and the team doing down there, given the situation?
Thanks, Patrick. It's been a rocky 2 or 3 months, but all things considered, I got to say we're holding up pretty well. And my kids are in the other room. Hopefully, they'll keep the noise down while we're on the line. But I think, like all of us, I'm just sort of trying to make the best of a difficult situation. But our staff has been terrific, and we've really been able to keep the work of the LBJ Library going forward.
Terrific. Well, I know you've got a lot to tell us. I've had the opportunity to be to the Johnson Library a couple times and visit. It's really a tremendous museum. And so I know our folks are eager to see it and hear from you. And I'm sure they've got a few questions, I'm guessing, on the Johnson legacy and probably on the Vietnam War, among other things. So I'll let you get to it and take it over.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. It's never hard to get a conversation going when the subject is LBJ. But let me start very quickly by saying thank you, Patrick, to you and to your whole team for making this event possible. It's a real honor to be with you and to be, I guess, going first in your series on the presidential libraries. And of course, thanks to everyone else who's on the line today. I hope you're sitting somewhere cool like I am. It's about 104 here in Austin today, so I'm really grateful for this chance just to sit still and think about something other than what's going on outside my windows. So Patrick asked me if I could get the ball rolling by talking a little bit about the presidential library, the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum, and I thought maybe the best way to do this would be via a little show and tell. Now, our building is closed these days, like all the 14 presidential libraries. but I'd like to give you a kind of virtual walkthrough to describe kind of the scope of what's inside this building, and of course to show you some of the highlights of what hopefully you'll be able to see one of these days when we can all go back to something like normal. So here in this first image is the LBJ Library, that big rectangular building over there on the left side as you look at it. This sits on the edge of the campus of the University of Texas at Austin. Just immediately to the right, I guess you would say, or maybe behind the library building in this slide, is another very distinctive building, that sort of low building with all the windows. That's the LBJ School of Public Affairs, which was established as a unit of the University of Texas at about the same time the library was opened in the early 1970s. So these two institutions have a long intermingled history, and sit right next to each other in this wonderful corner of the UT campus. Now, the library was opened in 1971, which means that our 50th anniversary is coming up next year. We're certainly hoping we can celebrate it properly with some, in-person events. We'll see. But in any case, it opens almost 50 years ago, and this was a little bit more than 2 years after LBJ left office in 1969. At that time, when the library opened, and I would even say really to this day, this building stands out as a really remarkable piece of architecture. Those of you who know something about architectural history might appreciate the name Gordon Bunshaft. He was the principal architect on this project. And any of you who've been to Austin know that this building sort of stands out on the Austin skyline in a very distinctive way. So with the next slide will take us to essentially the front door of the LBJ Library. Before you walk through that door, you're greeted here by none other than a life-size LBJ himself. I think this statue sort of gives you a sense of this imposing man's imposing size, all 6'3" of him, with these big hands that he used so effectively to grab the lapels, literally, if not figurative, if not quite literally, of his colleagues and aides to persuade them to take his view of important policy issues. So now let's go into the building. And one of the first things you see just after you wander through the entryway is a whole row of pens. And there are several of these displays scattered throughout the building. They're a striking reminder of how many pieces of legislation LBJ signed into law, many, many dozens of bills, giving LBJ one of the most impressive records of signing legislation into law of any modern president. Really, it seems to me, only FDR, really, perhaps in all of American history, comes close. And of course, many of the bills that LBJ signed into law were truly transformative, with enormous implications for the 21st century. So just for example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Medicare and Medicaid bills, the Immigration Act of 1965, Clean Air and Clean Water bills, numerous bills connected to the war on poverty, and on it goes. Now, to be fair, there are more pens than there are bills, because LBJ had this really distinctive habit of signing his name on many of these important bills, sort of one little stroke of a letter at a time, so that by the time he was done, he had used, let's say a couple of dozen pens, so that he could then hand them out to his aides and to members of Congress, so that everybody sort of had a stake in these landmark signing events. This is very distinctive LBJ, I think, in the sense that he tried to implicate people around him and ingratiate himself to the people who had been at his side as he pushed these important pieces of legislation. All right, let's go a little further into the building. And here, before too long, you encounter one of the most, surely the most impressive space in the whole building. This is the so-called Great Hall. This space is used, as you can tell here, for some small-scale exhibits, some temporary exhibits. It's also used for events, speakers, receptions, and so forth. But I think in many ways, the most important function of this space is simply to sort of capture the grandeur of the presidency, the importance of the LBJ era. You can just barely make out the presidential seal there on the north wall of this really imposing space. Now let's go to the next slide. And this is image of sort of what's behind you if you're looking in the direction where that previous slide took you. This gives you a little bit of a glimpse of what is surely the core, the very core of the LBJ library, its archival holdings. So behind these panes of glass are some of the archival boxes. In this case, they're a nice looking red, that contain the textual records of the Johnson administration, LBJ's life, the Johnson era. In all, we have about 45 million pages of documents. And again, just a few of them, just some of those boxes are displayed in this really nice way. Suffice it to say that there are many rows of these boxes that are not a nifty shade of red, that are sort of filling up the archive in the space behind what you can see here. Now, I want to point out that in addition to the textual records, impressive though they are, we also have about 1 million feet of film and about 650,000 photographs. And we also have audio recordings. And to my mind, these are very arguably the most striking holding of all, since they provide a really intimate feel, I think, for LBJ's personality, for his tone, for his style, for the way he interacted with people around him. Some of you may be familiar with these presidential recordings that have gradually been released from the LBJ library and other presidential libraries over the last 20, 25 years. The LBJ ones, I think, are particularly striking. Now, I thought I would, first of all, invite all of you to sample these recordings. Many of them are available from LBJ and other presidencies online. But just to give you a tiny sense of what these recordings sound like, I thought I would play for you an excerpt of one conversation that LBJ had with Everett Dirksen, the Republican minority leader in the Senate, in June of 1964. And Dirksen is in this conversation trying to persuade LBJ to support a dam. He wants a dam on a river back in his home state of Illinois. But before LBJ is done with this conversation, he sort of turns the tables and suggests to Dirksen what Dirksen can do for him rather than what he can do for Dirksen, or maybe more accurately, what Dirksen can do for LBJ in return for LBJ's support on the dam that's so near and dear to Dirksen. So let's listen to LBJ here persuading his former colleague and a very powerful Republican figure in Washington to get on board with a very high priority of Lyndon Johnson's, which was a tax bill that was very much touch and go in the spring of 1964. Let's listen to this.
Yeah, I just want to be sure that General Grant will.
Now, you're not going to beat me on excise taxes and ruin my budget this year. I've got Ways and Means holding hearings, and we're going to come up with a recommendation one way or the other. But don't beat me on that now. You can do it if you want to, and you can ruin my budget, but you're hollering the economy in and trying to balance it. Now, cut the deficit 50% under what Kennedy had it. Now, if you screw me up on excise taxes and get that thing going, I'll have hell. Now, let my Ways and Means Committee...
Now, look at the pressure I'm under.
No, you're not under.
Damn trade association.
Well, I know it, but God, you also for good fiscal prudence, and you know that the way to do this is through the House Committee, and you know if you put it in, you're not going to get it. They're not going to let you all write a bill over in the Senate on taxes, you know. Now, please don't press me on that.
I got to press it.
Well, who are you going to take? You going to take all your Republicans? Give me one or two of them, and let them be prudent. You've got people on there that can...
Well, you got enough votes to beat.
No, I haven't. You can beat me, and you ought to do it. And you see how you're going to let me win by one vote in there, and I'll call you back in a little bit on this.
You never talked that way when you were sitting in that front seat.
Yeah, well, I did if my country's involved. I voted for Ike one time. When Nolan voted against him, I cast the vote on his foreign aid and brought it out of the committee.
You're a hard bargainer.
And no, I'm not. But you just take care of me, and I'll look at this and see what I can do and call you right back.
All right.
So Dirksen here, of course, is referring to LBJ's period as the Senate Majority Leader when he used to sit in that seat, right? He used to be a member of Congress himself. In any case, I think it's a wonderful example, and there are an awful lot like that in the LBJ archival collection of the so-called Johnson treatment, these extraordinary persuasive skills that many commentators and historians would say were really crucial to LBJ's legislative accomplishments. Now, before I finish up here with this walkthrough of the LBJ library, let me take you briefly into our museum. So once you pass through the Great Hall and you see that imposing wall of archival boxes, you can head into the core permanent exhibit. And you're greeted, as that last slide showed, by a list of all of these legislative accomplishments that the Johnson administration, there we go, you can get us, if you can read this, I apologize, a little tricky to read, you can see many of the policy areas that the Johnson administration tackled during its time in office. Then you go a little further into the museum and you come to a gallery dedicated to the Kennedy assassination, of course, which propelled LBJ into the presidency. In this very somber part of the exhibit, one can see really, I think it seems to me, one of the most striking artifacts that we have on display, the very clothing that President Johnson and the First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, were wearing on Air Force One, and of course, throughout that tragic day. Here on display just to the left as you're looking at this slide of the famous image of LBJ and Jacqueline Kennedy aboard aboard the plane that would take him back to Washington, here of course taking the Oval Office. Okay, let's go a little further into the exhibit, and as you can I think easily imagine, a good deal of the museum is dedicated to the various policy areas that were addressed by LBJ's enormously ambitious domestic agenda, the Great Society. And I like this image because it touches on something as kind of central to how I think we think about the Great Society as healthcare. You can just see that over on the right side of the image. But there's also touches on Head Start over on the left side, this childhood education program that of course is still with us in the 21st century, an integral part of LBJ's war on poverty. And then in the middle is an exhibit that touches on LBJ's contributions to the arts. It is sometimes lost track of, I think, amid this flurry of really transformative legislation and weighty issues like race and poverty, that LBJ was also a leader in support for the arts. His legislation that he signed into law established the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, along with PBS and lots of other cultural landmarks. Let's go a little further into the exhibit, and here is another really striking artifact of the Johnson presidency. This is the very desk on which LBJ signed the Voting Rights Act into law in the summer of 1965. And let's go to the next. Of course, the exhibit also gives a good deal of attention to foreign policy generally and to the centerpiece of Johnson era foreign policy making, Vietnam. The exhibit, I think, does a nice job of challenging visitors to try to understand the complexity of the decisions that LBJ faced in connection with Southeast Asia, the competing pressures that weighed on him either to slow down the pace of American escalation or to escalate the war in very dramatic fashion, and helps, I think, visitors understand why he chose that distinctive middle course in Vietnam. The ways in which this issue beset his presidency and ultimately really contributed to his undoing politically in 1968. Now let me take you upstairs to the top floor of the library, where two of the most popular galleries are located. This is a recreation of the Oval Office, as I'm sure you can tell, in its Johnson era state. The story goes something like this. LBJ really wanted a full-scale replica of the Oval Office in the Johnson Presidential Library. And for some reason, the planners didn't include it. They thought it was just going to be too big, it would take up too much space. It just wasn't architecturally possible. And of course, LBJ, when he found out about this, wasn't at all pleased that the one thing he really wanted was being excluded. So he insisted on it. But at this point, the architects and the designers had to go back to LBJ, and one imagines their trepidation going back to this very persuasive man and saying, okay, Mr. President, we think we can do it, but we can't do it at 100% scale. So it has to be 7/8. So we are left today with a 7/8 scale replica of the Oval Office. And then finally, I wanted to show you this space, which is the workspace that Mrs. Johnson, Lady Bird Johnson, used in the, really after the library opened in 1971, and intermittently down to her death. She passed away in 2007, so lived for a good number of years following LBJ's passing in 1973, and used this space a fair amount over those years. And this space is left in the state in which she left it, with some nice 1960s flavor, I think, to it. And the photos on the desk, et cetera, that give, I think, a good sense of what she was all about, and the style that she tried to cultivate. So I will stop there and turn things over to Patrick and to any questions.
Great. Well, before we get to the questions, I want to remind folks that using the chat function in YouTube, you can ask your questions. I see a few are starting to come in now. Feel free to put those in there, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. And I wanted to thank everyone from all over the country here. We've got Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Somerset, Pennsylvania, Fairfax, Virginia, San Fran, Norman, Oklahoma, Fort Collins, Colorado, Bellingham, Washington, Salt Lake City, Maine, Niagara Falls, Brooklyn. We got pretty much the whole country covered. So lots of interest in LBJ, no doubt there. One of the things, before we jump into the questions as they queue up, I wanted to ask you about legacy. So we're living in extraordinary times, obviously, with everything that's happening. I say to my staff, the world changed in the U.S. in March as our country started to deal with the pandemic, and then again about six weeks ago around the social justice issues and those conversations that are gripping the country. So with that, we are looking at the legacies of some of our founding presidents and the founding fathers. So can you talk to us a little bit about LBJ's legacy, maybe right after his time in office, and as we get through 50 years later plus, how do people see him? How do historians see him? Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you for that. I really think that the way LBJ's legacy has unfolded over the years is one of the most extraordinary legacy stories of any president in American history. I think it's fair to say that when he left office, he was quite unpopular. I think that can be exaggerated. There was a distinct possibility he might have won re-election in 1968, but still, he was certainly weighed down by the problems, the urban unrest, the dissension within the Democratic Party, and of course, most of all, Vietnam. And I think that over the years, Vietnam has really shrouded his legacy. That has been the most important factor that has affected the way people think about the presidency as a whole. Until fairly recently, I would say. And I think it's been very interesting in recent times to see the ways in which LBJ's legacy has been reappraised. And I think there's a number of different things going on here. First of all, Vietnam is fading somewhat further into the past. Some of the passions around Vietnam, I think, have begun to cool a little bit. But at the same time, LBJ's domestic accomplishments have been receiving more and more attention, above all in the arena of civil rights, and maybe never more so than in the last few weeks or 2 or 3 months now. But also his accomplishments in fighting poverty, on immigration, on the environment, even on something like nuclear proliferation, which hasn't typically been something we've thought about in connection with LBJ. But it turns out, if you look carefully, his administration left behind a really remarkable record of what I think you could call success. There's also the fact that LBJ stands out now for his ability to get things done which is in short supply in Washington, I think many people would say. So this president who had this distinct ability just to get people to bend to his will and to sign all those bills into law really stands out in a remarkable way.
Yeah, that tape, that soundbite was really insightful to his. Obviously, he knew the institution, and he knew who he was talking to, and just a little insight there and how he got things done, because he had such a long history, obviously, in success and power in Congress as well. Well, let me jump to some of the questions here. Let's stay on this front about legacy. So, Bob Caro's biography has been mentioned. So I'm going to split their question. One is, when's the next volume going to be published? I think many people are wondering about that. I don't know if you have a special connection with Bob to know that. But then also other biographies folks might be interested to know that you recommend, maybe besides his, that are good for one reason or another, that you might suggest to folks who are watching today.
Yeah, absolutely. Boy, I wish I knew the answer to the question about Robert Caro's next volume. He is a mysterious character, and I'm sure has been asked that question so many times that he's probably become even more mysterious in offering answers. I really don't know, but one thing I can say is that when that book does appear, we will do everything possible to get him to the LBJ library and to get him on our stage. As far as other books about LBJ, there are a couple of biographies that I think are really terrific. Bob Dalek's book, I think this was just mentioned, is terrific. There's also a biography by a historian named Randall Woods at the University of Arkansas called Architect of Ambition. It's a very sympathetic biography. I think Dalek's is more kind of objective, more dispassionate. Woods is very much a champion, I think you could say, of LBJ. Caro's books, of course, especially the first volumes, are somewhat more critical of LBJ. So there's a nice mix there that I think you can get by looking at those three biographies, or in Caro's case, multi-volume biography of LBJ. Those are the biggies.
Okay. You mentioned the Lady Bird's office. Are her papers at the library?
Yes, indeed. We have a major collection of Lady Bird Johnson material, much of which has become open in relatively recent times. Some of that material, by the way, is available on the website, which is called Discover LBJ, that the LBJ Foundation established a few years ago. So if anyone is interested, even in the times of COVID and library shutdowns, you can see that. And by the way, along with lots of other material electronically. But we know there's a lot of interest in Lady Bird, and for that reason, this was a high priority for digitization.
Mm-hmm. So she had an office there, and what was her level of engagement with the library in terms of, obviously the years after the White House and once it was open?
Yeah, it was relatively high, I would say, and it certainly declined over time as she grew older and encountered some health problems. But I remember when I first came to Austin in 2000, seeing her as a regular participant at library events. And it's clear to me from the stories I've heard others tell who've been in this town longer than I have, that she was very active and used her office space going back into the 1980s and 1990s.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, we have a number of family questions. Are LBJ's daughters involved with the library?
They are indeed. Linda Robb lives in Virginia, and so it's a bit more of a challenge for her to get to Austin, but I would say that she's here multiple times in normal times, is here multiple times a year, and seems always to be here for the big events. And her sister, Lucy, lives in Austin and is a regular participant in library events, as you might imagine. Both of them are very active in the LBJ Foundation and deeply engaged in the life of the library.
Terrific. And I can proudly say his granddaughter is on our board at the National Archives Foundation. So we have good connections. So here's one. Do you have a favorite document? And I'm going to add to that, or what's the most unusual item in the LBJ holdings?
Wow. Most unusual item. You know, there's so many things that come to mind. So here's one of my favorites, and I will confess to you, I did not know that the LBJ Library held this item until I came on board as director of the library back in January. So we hold the original art for Dr. Seuss's Lorax book that everybody, at least who's roughly in my age group, knows all about the Lorax. And these beautiful original paintings that became that book are in our collections. And the story that gets told about that is that, you know, Dr. Seuss was at a White House event, and back in, I don't know the date, 1968 or 67 or so, and was sitting next to Lady Bird Johnson. And Lady Bird Johnson, of course, asked none other than Dr. Seuss what he was working on. And he said, well, he was thinking about this book about environmentalism that became the Lorax. And Lady Bird apparently told LBJ that what she had just learned. And he went over to Dr. Seuss and said, thank you so much for donating the artwork for that book to the LBJ library. So another good example of LBJ's persuasive techniques. But it worked in this case. And we have this really striking art, which is not what one expects, right? When one walks into a building connected to a president known for, you know, rightly so, for things like civil rights and the Vietnam War and poverty. We also have some quirky items like that really make it an even more special place.
Okay, here's a political question for you. Did Robert Kennedy try to wrestle the '64 nomination from LBJ?
You know, so yeah, a political question, a controversial question. You get 10 historians in a room, and I think you get 10 different opinions. In my own view, there's certainly some evidence that RFK thought hard about it, right? This was he was, as everybody knows, lots of tension with LBJ over the years. Was not at all convinced that LBJ should be the guy in 1964, and clearly thought about his own candidacy and was nudged in this direction as well, certainly by many of his supporters. But it seems to me, you know, there were also other contenders in 1964 whose names were mentioned. So RFK predictably is the one who, you know, is a major part of the way the story gets told because of the well-known conflict between them. In my view, it never really became something that had a lot of traction or, you know, really came close to being the decision of the Democratic Party. LBJ really had the party in his hands in 1964.
Okay, I think we've got a couple foreign policy questions. Did LBJ keep virtually all of Kennedy's foreign policy after the '64 election?
Really interesting. He certainly kept all of JFK's foreign policy advisors, which I know is not the question that's being asked, but it's revealing, right? LBJ clearly felt that foreign policy was his weakness, right? This was an area where he needed to demonstrate continuity because Kennedy, by the time he was assassinated, had a pretty good reputation for foreign policy, at least with most of the American political spectrum. So he wanted to cultivate an image of continuity. And he uses the word continuity all the time in both domestic and foreign policy, but certainly in the foreign policy realm. But that's the rhetorical level. So what's the reality? To what extent did LBJ actually stick with Kennedy's policies? I would say it's a mixed bag. I think on the all-important case of Vietnam, LBJ did shift gears in significant ways. I think there's a strong case to be made that JFK was extremely wary about deployment of large numbers of American combat forces in Vietnam, and that had he lived, he would have done everything conceivable to keep from having to make that kind of decision. Whereas for LBJ, he wasn't as attuned to many of the reasons for caution in Vietnam. I think LBJ deferred more to advisors around him, and wherever there was consensus, he was willing to go with that consensus. Kennedy was much more self-assured in the realm of foreign policy and pushed back when he felt pressure to act in hawkish and bold ways.
Okay.
But
so
LBJ certainly wanted to preserve Kennedy's momentum toward détente and arms control and better relations with the Soviet Union. There's no question about that.
sort of on that same thread, what did LBJ think of America's objectives should be in Vietnam?
Well, I mean, I think LBJ's sense of the American purpose in Vietnam was to preserve an independent South Vietnam at a manageable cost to the United States in treasure, in blood, and also, I have to say, to his domestic agenda. He wanted, in other words, to avoid defeat in Vietnam while protecting his domestic priorities. And this was the constant balancing act, I think, for LBJ. And it's invited an awful lot of criticism from historians and other commentators over the years. But I think if we put ourselves back into LBJ's shoes, one can appreciate pretty readily why he saw the problem in the way he did. He knew that if he fought a major war in Vietnam, it was likely to suck political energy and resources out of the things that mattered most to him. And yet, if he didn't choose to fight in Vietnam, he would have another version of the same problem. It would invite criticism from the hawks, from the far right, in a way that might make it harder for him to get his legislative agenda through Congress. So he was really in a bind. And that's why it seems to me he chose this middle course, hoping to avoid the pitfalls of leaning too far either way.
Did he, when out of office, did he ever express regret for these decisions around Vietnam policy?
That's a really interesting question. To my mind, he never really expressed regret. What he did express was a strong sense of the bind, of the impossibility of the bind in which he felt himself. And I think what he tended to say to interviewers, to journalists and others after he left office was, look, you really have to understand how difficult this problem was and appreciate why I saw the problem in the way I did and why I made the decisions I made. So he says repeatedly, I felt as though if I didn't fight, I was going to lose the Great Society. If I fought at too high a level of intensity, I was going to lose the Great Society. The domestic agenda was his top priority. And I think it really helps to understand his foreign policy choices to always bear that in mind.
And then I think two more here. Did he ever regret not running for re-election? Did he ever express that? By
all accounts, after the '68 election was over and done with, he reveled in his new life of peace and quiet, chances to spend time with his family. And I think there's a lot of evidence in the written record, even photographs of LBJ spending time with his grandchildren from 1969, 70, 71, 72, et cetera, that I think really bear that out. But at the same time, I mean, anyone who spends any time trying to understand LBJ, I think knows that this guy was a political animal to his core, and it had to have been devastating for him to step away in 1968 to see his party go in another direction, and probably to see how his presidency was being understood and discussed in those early years after he left office. It had to have been a great source of regret to him.
Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about, I know we're in sort of a unique situation. The museum isn't open, so it'd be easy to say what's next on your agenda. But what is coming up? You're relatively new to the position, but I know you've got a big anniversary coming up. Can you tell us a little bit what, if folks, let's assume we get through what we're getting through, the museum is back open, hopefully by next year, and folks can have the comfort to act like we've always acted and get to enjoy our history and cultural institutions. What could they look forward to if they come to Austin and visit the LBJ Library?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. As you say, we are planning on only virtual events in the near term. We have some great stuff going on, I think. A series of speakers this fall, at events focused on the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, that's coming up just next month, actually. But next year, you're quite right, is a big one for the LBJ Library, our 50th anniversary. In normal times, we would have had a big event, or probably multiple big events, honestly, bringing speakers in to reflect on different parts of the Johnson legacy and different ongoing public policy problems that are connected to that period. And I think what we will surely do is some of that virtually. So we'll be trying certainly to draw big audiences via Zoom or YouTube or whatever the program is, to do some of that. We are also thinking about trying to publish a book of top scholars engaging with the Johnson presidency and its legacies to cover some of the questions that we've been addressing today, frankly, that would be a nice resource for people going forward. We'll continue to do education events aimed at teachers and students. We'll continue to put our exhibits online. Hopefully, if COVID continues into the indefinite future, people will be able to take a virtual tour via video, not just the still images that I showed you today. So we have a lot of balls in the air. It's a little too early to say exactly what next year will look like, but we're trying to be as ambitious as we can under the circumstances.
Terrific. Well, you've made our inaugural, you set the bar on the inaugural series here. So thank you. You've made it easy for me, and lots of terrific questions. So delighted to have you and to have the opportunity to feature the Johnson Library. And I do encourage folks to go down and experience in person when you can do that. It's a tremendous museum and facility, and Austin's a great town. And maybe in cooler weather, folks can make their way there and enjoy it. So thank you, Mark, for your time this afternoon, and look forward to hopefully we'll give you a little bump in both virtual attendance and some in-person attendance when the opportunity gets better.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. So I want to say a few things here before we wrap up. We really want to thank everybody who tuned in today, especially our donors and members. You too can be a cool part of U.S. history by affiliating with the National Archives Foundation, the National Archives. We invite all kinds. In fact, my staff remind me we've never turned down someone for membership. So go to archivesfoundation.org and you can sign up for membership in the archives. Also, if you have not heard of our store, we have the best gift store for U.S. history merchandise, the National Archives, some really creative products. We encourage you to go to nationalarchivesstore.org. If you're interested in this, and this week we've got some terrific things going on. We've got a sale for 50% off. So I hope you'll have a chance to get in there and get some deals. I've done a curveball to my staff because I realized I forgot to talk about the programs coming up. So what we've got coming up is a lot of fun. On Thursday, just 2 days away, we've got Teddy Roosevelt. I'll be talking to our 26th president, and I hope you'll tune in for that. I think that'll be a fun and interesting conversation. And then at the end of the month, we've got a good friend of mine from American Heritage Chocolate, Dave Borghesani, who is going to talk to us about a delicious topic, the history of chocolate. Mars is a funder of the Archives Foundation, and Dave is a terrific ambassador for Mars and their historic chocolate, which we also sell in our store. He does a great program, so I hope you'll plan for that. That's July 30th at 5 p.m. So on behalf of the National Archives Foundation, I want to thank you for joining us. Until our next program, which is just 2 days away, be safe and be well.